A very warm welcome to the live stream today. We're going to get started with a special guest, Iwona Bisaga, who is joining us today. We'll give a few moments for people to join, and then we'll get going in just a few moments. Right, a very warm welcome to the session today. I'm very pleased to have Iwona Bisaga with us today, as I mentioned a moment ago, as Global Clean Cooking Lead at Norwegian Capacity, NORCAP, and the Global Platform for Action on Sustainable Energy in Displacement Settings, which long word is abbreviated to GPA. Iwona is playing an important role in addressing energy access needs in the context of displaced people. Iwona is based in Rwanda. You're in Kigali, aren't you, Iwona?
Correct.
And you are working with UNITAR, which is the UN Institute for Training and Research. Today we'll be diving deep into the critical role of energy in the context of humanitarian and displaced settings. We'll explore the challenges, the opportunities, innovative solutions that are making a real difference. We'll talk about the approaches being used to mobilize climate finance, the difficulties encountered, some of those challenges, and explore some of the potential solutions. So, Iwona, warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much for having me today, Grant.
So we first met, I think, in 2017, 2018, as part of the Isulabantu project at the University of Westminster, didn't we?
That's right. Yes. That was still at the time I was in the process of completing my my PhD at University College London. Joined the Isulabantu project in April 2018 and continued supporting it for a couple of years, even after my graduation. The focus was more on environmental management, but it certainly had very interesting components of energy access as well in the context of informal settlements, particularly in South Africa. And I must say that there are a lot of parallels and lessons learned from those contexts that we can definitely bring in and learn from in the humanitarian sector.
Right. And you were studying your PhD in parallel. What did you focus in on?
So my PhD focused specifically on off-grid solar solutions for rural electrification. I was working in close collaboration with an industry partner, a company called Bbox. And I zoomed in on Rwanda, where at the time, between 2015 2018, there was a lot of activity around sort of bringing in decentralized off-grid solar solutions into the electrification agenda and into the energy policy and strategy. Subsequently, this has now, in two iterations of the energy and sort of development strategies of Rwanda, been very much included as one of the key sort of factors and means of providing first-time electrification to particularly rural, more remote households where the grid is unlikely to reach in the coming years. I then, sort of as part of my PhD, started also engaging with the humanitarian energy access agenda, given that off-grid solar solutions were started to being introduced in the refugee camps in both Rwanda and Kenya. And as it happened, BWOCs were involved in those initiatives at the time.
Okay, so that started to be the transition to something more focused on displaced people. Yeah,
exactly.
But, yeah, thanks very much for that initial insight into what brought you there. As we get going today, I just want to invite people that may be watching us live or watching it afterwards. Please introduce yourself in the comments. We'll have a good look at the comments after the session, but we'll also have the opportunity to respond to questions that you might ask during the session if you're in the live session. So please do, first of all, introduce yourself and say who you are, where you're from. It's great to know there's an audience out there. It's great to connect with you. And also, when you have questions, when things come to mind, when there's a pause in the discussions, please put in questions. We'll be very happy to look at them and try and address them as we go along. So in the introduction, Iwona, I mentioned that you work with NORCAP and the GPA. Can you tell us a little bit about those organizations, the initiatives, what you do there?
Yeah, very happy to. Yeah. In my role, I work concurrently with the two organizations. So the Global Platform for Action, as I'll be sort of referring to them, the GPA, are an interagency collaboration initiative or platform bringing together different stakeholders, both UN and non-UN actors, around this humanitarian energy access agenda. It was started around 2017, 2018 in response to the identified gap in the sort of UN cluster system, which as such does not have energy access as a standalone sort of cluster specifically, and yet energy access really underpins all of the clusters that you see in that specific system, whether it's shelter, whether it's wash, whether it's protection, etc. Without energy access, it's very hard to provide, those services and provide protection and so on. We focus on not only collaborating with partners working on this challenge of addressing energy access in displacement or humanitarian settings, but also on, building the evidence base. So really filling in the knowledge gaps that exist on policy advocacy. So we're a very strong voice, we're trying to bring this unified voice of the humanitarian energy space to policymakers, to international global agendas on energy access to make sure that displaced populations are included. We also provide support and technical assistance to partners and capacity buildings on issues around energy models and energy model or energy access delivery, and issues around financing, funding, access, etc. So really a sort of multi-pronged, agenda. And Norwegian Capacity, which sits under the Norwegian Refugee Council, is a close partner to the GPA and is the biggest energy expertise provider to the humanitarian system, particularly through the UN, but not only.
Okay.
So effectively what we do is we provide energy expertise through energy experts to humanitarian agencies working on this challenge, and aim to really bring in the missing capacity. As such, where I sit at the NORCAP sort of head office, we support the energy experts, of which we have tens. I don't know the exact number at the moment, but it's a large number working alongside those agencies to help facilitate access to clean energy, including clean cooking in displacement settings. And this can take, a form of technical assistance, of delivery of specific projects, design and implementation, funding applications, which I think will also be coming up in our conversation later on, and so on. So really trying to help bring that capacity and facilitate access to clean energy at scale.
Okay, fantastic. So for those that want to investigate further, I've put up here the GPA link. If I understood exactly that sort of role, it tries to bring a sort of a coordination around this issue of energy and energy access in this context.
That's right.
Because it touches on everything, but it's not it's not included in as a sort of a foundational.
Yes, exactly.
Pillar, yeah?
It on the one hand, it's omnipresent, but on the other hand, it's absent.
Yeah.
In the humanitarian system, in the humanitarian cluster system in particular, and so that's why the GPA is trying to bring in this coalition of of stakeholders, of partners working towards advancing this, really Sustainable Development Goal 7 agenda, but specifically, for displacement and humanitarian settings, to ensure that genuinely nobody is left behind.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think we're going to come back to that idea of omnipresent and yet hidden. I mean, that's very profound, I think, in terms of the overall makeup of energy and energy access within, well, actually all of life, but very much so within a refugee or displaced community or humanitarian emergency response type of context.
Yeah.
You also talked about NORCAP. I wasn't aware that it's such a significant presence within this context, and there are tens of energy advisors, are they called?
Energy experts, yes.
Energy
advisors.
Experts.
Yeah.
Okay. They work in that advisory type role in terms of technical assistance, support. You mentioned support with trying to mobilize finance, but also address a whole range of different issues.
Correct. And they're embedded in those agencies or in those organizations, really working towards providing these services and ensuring that they are delivered, where they're missing. And I think this is really, this also opens up more opportunities for that sort of coordinated collaboration, because you have this body of, of experts who are all part of NORCAP, which in turn, works very closely with the GPA on this sort of joint agenda, towards advancing SDG 7 for displacement settings. And in that way, we can, more easily facilitate cross-learning and knowledge exchange and work towards something that is more unified, more coordinated, and strengthen that collaboration for I think ultimately, improved delivery of energy services, and doing it better, more efficiently, and at scale that really is needed. Because what we have seen historically in the sector is that there's a lot of fragmentation, a lot of sort of piecemeal activities that only ever target a small proportion of the a huge number of displaced. I mean, we're talking about over 120 million forcibly displaced people in the world, and in sub-Saharan Africa alone, it's over or close to 45 million displaced people, and among those, approximately 20 million refugees, and that's actually in sub-Saharan Africa alone, let alone in North Africa, in the region. That's the numbers are significant.
Yeah, those are huge figures. And one of the things, so I had the privilege of working a small amount in a project 2017, 2018, supporting UNHCR, and trying to mobilize climate finance for activities UNHCR was taking forward. And one of the things that really was impressed upon me at the time, I sort of had a vague awareness of it, is that the idea of this, I guess, tension between refugees or displaced people being seen as a temporary issue versus this long-term. I was staggered by some of the figures in terms of how long temporary refugee camps and refugee areas have been in existence around the world.
Yes, and that's one of the common misperceptions, particularly, you know, around refugee camps, refugee settlements, and refugee populations residing in those, where, yeah, there's this idea that, you know, they will move back or they will be resettled to, you know, to another location. But in reality, you know, data shows that over the decades, the average time spent in a refugee camp or settlement for a refugee, particularly on the African continent, you know, is somewhere between 5 to 15 years, I believe, if not longer. And some of these camps have been in existence for decades. We're talking about truly protracted crisis where, you know, the opportunities and the possibilities for people to return to their homes are limited or close to none. Some of them have simply started, you know, a new life in those countries hosting them, and are not even thinking or considering going back. I mean, let alone the situations where there's ongoing conflict back home. This is simply impossible. It's true that there is some level of movement, even if it is internally in the hosting country. Some refugees choose to move to urban settings, for example, seeking employment where that is permitted. Because again, different countries have different policies towards refugees. In some cases, those prohibit refugees from engaging in any paid employment or activity. Yet where those policies, those environments are more favorable, of course, we do see some level of movement, but in reality, grand majority remain, you know, in the camps, in the settlements, in the areas where they originally settle, following a conflict, following, you know, them fleeing their homes.
Yeah, it's one of the really complex tensions there with host communities who are generously hosting, but also are experiencing a massive influx of people who, depending on the situation and country, as I'm hearing you say, they perhaps may not be allowed to work or to take employment of any sort. So yeah, a lot of tensions can arise in that situation. And that idea of taking work or not, or a lot of it comes down to the idea of this being temporary versus permanent. When you're talking 15 years potentially in a refugee camp, that's not temporary. But when you acknowledge, okay, now people can work, it somehow makes it feel more permanent, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. And interestingly, the same sort of applies when we talk about energy access. So the reason, you know, many of the areas hosting refugees, be it in camps, which are perhaps, you know, and here a little bit of a distinction, more sort of delineated and often, you know, sort of fenced out, you know, enclosed spaces where refugees are provided with shelter, versus, you know, settlements where these are perhaps more open, you know, not as clearly demarcated. And that's, for example, the case in Uganda, where we talk about refugee settlement versus, for example, in Rwanda, where we talk about refugee camps. So the same goes for energy access. And the reason why many of those settings at large are not connected to the national grid, for example, or included in national programs targeting access to clean cooking, but in particular the national grid network, is because then there's this sort of acknowledgement that, you know, these are perhaps more permanent spaces than the governments would like them to be. But yeah, the reality is that, you know, given the sort of time span and the lifespan of those settings, these are critical services that obviously people need for day-to-day survival, for you know, for existence. Sometimes we're allowed for, you know, for productive activities, for income generating activities. And especially when we look at clean cooking, which is kind of now what I've been really focusing over the last few years, in humanitarian response, and this sort of often continues into the sort of change of that status into protracted crisis. So years after the emergency and the early sort of response, agencies such as the World Food Programme do provide food rations, for example. But then what's offered if you can't cook the rice or the dry foods that you receive, right? And some of them might be ready to consume, like energy biscuits, but that's largely sort of in the emergency response, the immediate sort of response after the influx, after the conflict. But in protracted crisis, we're talking about all different kinds of foods that are provided, but they require energy to be cooked. So imagine if somebody is lacking that, or if those resources that are readily available, which we assume are readily available, like firewood that people have to go and collect, are no longer there because of various factors. Obviously the sort of competing, demand also with the host community, but also the exacerbating impacts of climate change, which are causing droughts, which are, reducing the sort of biodiversity and availability of biomass in those areas, which, a lot of, when you look at particularly sub-Saharan Africa, those camps and settlements hosting refugees are, quite remote, often in arid areas. So the abundance of biomass is by no means a given.
Right. So there is potentially provision of food. This might be rice. It needs to be cooked. In order to cook it, people without money, income, devices will cook on an open fire. They need to collect wood in order to cook on the open fire. The area where they are doesn't have a large availability of wood to begin with. Now you have reasonably dense population that is there needing to go out and collect wood in order to be able to cook.
That's right. A fascinating yet heartbreaking example that we're also engaged in at the GPA, along with multiple partners on the ground, is Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So sort of stepping out of the African continent for a moment. But the influx of the Rohingya refugees in 2017 and the sort of, what followed really shows to what extent, that demand for firewood can deplete the natural environment. So if you look at sort of 2018 and Cox's Bazar, where the refugee camp, or in fact, 33 refugee camps all close together are located, that area literally turned from, a forest to a desert because of the demand for firewood to cook and also to build shelter. And of course, this is not to say that, we're blaming the refugees for that there or anywhere else. Absolutely not. This is their only option. This is the only way that they can provide food, for their families. And so what UNHCR and IOM did, upon also a directive from the government, seeing what was happening, they introduced LPG, so cooking gas, as an alternative. And granted, now when you go there, and even just a couple of years after the introduction of LPG, that area turned back into, a green sort of lush space, because that demand was dramatically reduced, the demand for firewood. However, of course, that comes at a cost, because refugees cannot pay for the cooking gas. So at the moment, it is provided free of charge to all refugee households in Cox's Bazar by UNHCR and IOM. But just an example of, how large, how significant that demand is. There we're talking about, close to now 1 million refugees. But whether we're talking about 50,000 households or whether we're talking about 200,000 households, it's a huge stress. It's a huge, impact on the local environment.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've just been speaking a short time, and I'm feeling some of that burden of the challenge. Really, there's a significant need. The populations that by no choice of their own are displaced have a huge challenge on their hands. They are not in their home country, perhaps, or they're displaced from one part to another. They have to cook to survive. What do? They don't have resources. They don't have money. This is an extremely difficult environment for the individuals in the settlements or the camps.
Absolutely.
Now, the solutions, one of the solutions you talked about there is an ongoing and continuous supply of, in that case, LPG. Can you briefly just talk about some of the other, I guess these are technical solutions, or perhaps it's broader than just a technical type of solution?
Yeah, it's there are multiple sort of factors that feed into the decisions that were made to focus on LPG specifically and to bring that in as the solution to address the very fast depleting sort of forest resource. So there exist multiple other options. Cooking gas is not the only clean and modern solution that can address this sort of huge challenge. There are other improved biomass solutions such as pellets or briquettes that effectively have a higher sort of calorific value embedded in them and therefore are much more efficient. So with a relatively small amount of biomass, you can ensure that households get the same sort of amount of energy that is needed to cook, yet that still relies on biomass. So often what happens for these solutions is that, for example, wood scraps are used or any other sort of biomass waste that is otherwise not utilized, that is sort of channeled towards the production of those. But that requires, again, when we talk about these numbers, that requires scale, and that often doesn't exist. In the case of Cox's Bazar, that was simply not available in the market. What was readily available was cooking gas. However, we at the GPA have just piloted a very small pilot of electric cooking in the refugee camps as well as in the host community. That was very well received. And we are actually in the process of sort of modeling, what that clean cooking stack, so a combination of different cooking solutions, if you wish, could look like, for example, in pairing LPG and electricity to even alleviate that burden of, the close to $30 million a year to provide a sufficient amount of LPG to the refugees, and complemented with solar-powered electric cooking. Of course, there are challenges associated with that as well. I mean, even just the, sole question of can the shelters, which are really not very sophisticated, often, built using bamboo, can they even hold, the panels that would be required to power electric cooking appliances with solar PV energy? But yet, this was the electric cooking option was very well received, both in refugee households as well as in the host communities. And this is work that will actually also inform that the opportunity that is currently being looked at of tapping into carbon finance specifically to use that to sort of subsidize the provision of these solutions to the refugee households, especially given that they're unable to pay for them because they can't engage, in the case of Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, in paid employment, which is not the case in some other contexts and other countries, for example, in Uganda or Rwanda and numerous others. But this is one of the areas that multiple humanitarian partners are, currently exploring. We are also very much supporting on that and doing a lot of research, trying to understand, how to best tap into climate finance, including carbon finance, be it through voluntary carbon markets or compliance markets, to provide access more affordably, provide access to truly clean and sustainable solutions, whether it is solar-powered electric cooking. And here I can refer the audience to to a report that we wrote with colleagues at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, as well as the World Food Programme last year, on powering progress and creating markets for solar e-cooking technologies in displacement settings specifically. Thank you, Grant. That talks about how we can really sort of leverage that for these solutions that have the potential to address the clean cooking challenge, also address the broader access to energy challenge, because when we look at solar PV, that can also help satisfy the basic needs like lighting, mobile phone charging, that are the kind of most critical ones, if you wish, in those settings that even today, many of the refugees, of the displaced, are unable to benefit from, because access to electricity is similarly limited. Even if perhaps we've seen more interventions, more sort of activity around those off-grid, deploying off-grid solutions to those settings, then we perhaps seen really truly sustainable, clean cooking sort of energy access provision. So yeah, certainly, something that is very much of interest, and yet it has been very limited to date in displacement settings and humanitarian settings specifically.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about a cooking stack. Often we just think there's one solution, but for all of those like us that are energy rich, we're using multiple appliances in any one day. Maybe there's 8 or 9 different appliances that are used for different purposes. And that combination, mixing different technologies, LPG plus electricity and such like, is far more sophisticated type of perspective on addressing different types of needs at different moments and different opportunities. Now, mobilizing finance, you mentioned climate finance, and there are, of course, the different types of approaches to it. What are really, I understand it's a huge challenge to mobilize any form of climate finance in this sector. What have you explored? What are the challenges there?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's a very sort of complex, topic, and something that we're all trying to sort of get to grips with. I would say that we have done a lot of work trying to understand primarily what are the main challenges. Why are we not seeing more, especially carbon finance? And then I'll come back to the sort of like more global climate finance question in a moment. But talking about, tapping into, for example, voluntary carbon markets for clean cooking, we see, if you go to Gold Standard, to Verra, the certification agencies, you see, multiple projects focusing on clean cooking. But if you then, see through them with that keyword humanitarian or displacement of refugees, sadly, that then becomes, really just a handful. And yet this is where we could really leverage, that funding, that finance, immensely, and obviously benefit, from it significantly, given the barriers. So just to mention a few, humanitarian settings, in particular, sort of emergency response, that sort of is seen as not really viable, because at that stage there is a very huge sort of level of uncertainty about how long we're going to be dealing with that situation, right? Even if the number of people is enormous. So let's say for that, we're not really currently looking at carbon finance. But for protracted crisis, as we were talking earlier, we certainly are. And here we, again, talking about large numbers of refugee households. However, often not in sort of one location. So even in a country like Uganda that hosts 1.7 million refugees, they spread across multiple refugee settlements. And so it's hard to achieve that sort of level of scale that is required for a carbon project, because you have that, a bit of fragmentation, distribution. These settlements are often in areas hard to reach. because they're more remote in sort of less wealthy parts of the country. And so this comes with, obvious challenges, especially of access. These are also complex operational environments. We're talking about, multiple UN agencies involved, different government sort of agencies involved in who have the mandate, to protection of, sort of managing these settlements and these settings at large. And for a carbon project developer, likewise for a private sector player to navigate these environments can be challenging.
Mm-hmm.
These are not obvious, places to work in. So perhaps, what we see is that private sector in particular tend to focus on easier to reach, lower hanging fruits, and maybe, not these settings, given the complexity, but also given the perceived sort of risk, right? Risk that we have lower ability to pay. At least this is what we often think is the case. Might not always be true, but still risk of relocation. Again, something we touched on briefly earlier. That people will leave, will move, and you need to have that permanence. You need to have the ability to monitor that these solutions are being used, that there's continued sort of emission reductions, and you need to guarantee that for 5 to 10 years, usually at minimum, right?
Yeah.
There are high transaction costs that are associated with developing carbon projects, and let's be honest. I mean, when we're talking about providing the most critical services to the refugees, many of the agencies working there don't have that kind of amount, to spend to develop a carbon project, and it's not necessarily straightforward to fundraise for that, because also of the other mandate that they have. And for the private sector, again, the companies that are already working on energy access, clean cooking, electrification, other energy uses in those settings tend to be quite small, have limited access to capital, have limited capacity and understanding of the carbon markets, and so are not necessarily best positioned to tap into those. And then things like additionality, for example, can also be seen as difficult to measure, because there are so many different overlaying interventions in those settings, that different NGOs, UN agencies, private sector, other partners are working on. So again, it might be somewhat more complex, not impossible, but complex to sort of assess that and prove that. So these are some of the key ones that we're facing and that we're trying to sort of understand. How can we help mitigate them? What's needed, who's needed at the table in order for us to be able to really build, projects, programs in this space and really, benefit from carbon finance. And maybe just briefly on the, sort of access to global climate finance through the likes of the Global Environment Facility or the Global Green Climate Fund. Sorry. Again, we haven't seen many projects, and I think you're aware of maybe a couple that have specifically worked in settings that host displaced populations, but perhaps limited in terms of scope on energy access and cooking. But the reality is that we're talking about very few UN agencies who do have that sort of humanitarian mandate being accredited by those agencies, right? So I think for the GCF, it's 5. Out of which I believe 3 have that humanitarian mandate, or 2, and then for the GEF we're talking about 4. So it's something that is at the moment too prohibitive. How to get accreditation, how to tap into it. It is perceived by many humanitarian actors who would be willing to pursue it, because we're talking about significant amounts that one can tap into, significant funding that could help advance that agenda, especially Nexus agenda, so energy access, agriculture, livelihoods, and others. but yeah, it's seen as, very challenging to navigate, very difficult to sort of get accreditation for. And if you do want to, go for the accredited agencies, you need to have an existing sort of partnership and a very clearly sort of defined roles and be able to really sort of leverage that and their their presence in those sort of global climate spheres, if you wish. So we simply haven't seen that, at any significant level of scale yet, and hopefully that will change down the line.
Okay, yeah. Wow, there's a whole lot to unpack there in terms of the complexity. I'm hearing in terms of the either the compliance or voluntary carbon market side of things, just really massive challenges related to risk, fragmentation, complexity, and time frame. Right, just trying to capture some of the points that you made there. The fragmentation, that you don't have these populations in one place with clear boundaries. There's a lot of potential leakage from the sites themselves. Complexity in terms of so many different actors involved. You mentioned additionality in that particular case as well. And the risk for perhaps private sector players, for any player, to get involved in that, and partly the complexity, partly the time frame. We're looking at a 5 to 10 year time frame at least. And so, having the predictability and the stability and the knowledge that you can invest now and we're going to recover those costs over a long extended period, when the situation is, well, stable, but perceived perhaps as quite volatile, as quite changeable. Yeah,
exactly.
That makes that market extremely difficult, and the monitoring aspects of those are they're difficult normally for a stove project, right?
Absolutely.
But you've got that by a factor of 10 or 100 in additional complexity.
Yeah. And this speaks also to the question of, data and reliable, robust data sets that are needed to set up carbon projects, but then also to, to monitor them, to demonstrate, the continuity, the permanence, etc. And especially now in today's climate with, the recent announcements by ICBCM on the approval of, sort of, let's say, robust, trustworthy carbon credit methodologies by Gold Standard and Vera, in light of the recent scandals associated with carbon credits for clean cooking projects. And I think that also absolutely refers to other sort of climate projects like reforestation, afforestation. These have been subject to increased levels of scrutiny, and so one also needs to be mindful, but that this needs to be done right, not just in order to demonstrate that the intended sort of outcomes are really happening, but also that they're done ethically. And I think now we're also seeing, increased sort of activity in the sort of ethics of carbon finance. The Clean Cooking Alliance recently released, ethical or guidelines for, ethical carbon finance for clean cooking. And so these are, the types of sort of guide rails, if you wish, that, we also need to be mindful of, and we need to be considering. But yeah, certainly, you sort of summarized it very well. A lot of challenges, but not insurmountable. And so what is reassuring is that different sort of humanitarian partners as well as non-humanitarian partners are actually increasingly looking at inclusion of displacement settings, refugee communities, for example, where there are projects that target host communities, and vice versa. So, for example, the Refugee Environmental Protection Fund recently launched an expression of interest for consortia to submit proposals on clean cooking and agroforestry / reforestation and the sort of nature-based solutions for refugee and host communities in Rwanda and Uganda. And so this also shows that, that kind of more holistic approach, a more integrated approach, both in terms of looking at clean cooking, but not in isolation, but also recognizing that, for some of the solutions, especially if you're looking at improved biomass, you should also be looking at making sure that these, resources are being replenished and that this is sustainable, but also integrated in a sense that we look across the board and stop sort of differentiating between, refugees and host communities, because the reality is that they face the same challenges accessing energy, whether it's energy for, powering appliances or whether it's energy for cooking.
Yeah. Okay. This discussion was billed for 45 minutes, but I hope people that are watching it will be okay if we go on a little bit, and I hope that's okay with you, Iwona.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't believe it's already quarter to.
Yeah, I'm finding it fascinating. I'm really interested to learn from you about these challenges and the need. You've just presented it so well. The idea that this is about mitigation. It's absolutely clear and convincing, at least it is to me, that it's a mitigation issue because the alternatives are high emitting. Cooking with biomass, especially in a deforestation context, possibly the highest carbon intensity cycle in the world. It's especially with a lot of black carbon being emitted and things like that. So I can really see that attraction of a mitigation type. There should be an opportunity there on a mitigation side of things. But I just suspect that the complexities of at least a compliance market and a voluntary carbon market, especially with all those the scandals of recent times, and just the huge cost of monitoring, measuring the impact, addressing leakage, addressing additionality, those complexities. I just feel that maybe we need a shift. And I'm absolutely sure what I'm saying is not revolutionary, but I think we need a shift from looking at this as a mitigation issue to looking at it as a resilience issue and a vulnerability issue, an adaptation one.
100%. Yes, I think it really is a combination of of the three. And if you think about the challenge of not having clean sustainable energy for for cooking in particular, let's focus on cooking, the associated carbon emissions that come with the heavy use of biomass. We're talking about multiple other negative impacts, not just on the natural environment because that's getting depleted, but also on human health. One of the main sort of health conditions that we see, particularly in women, is respiratory diseases, upper respiratory diseases, which absolutely are related to the inhalation of the smoke that comes from cooking. That unfortunately they are exposed to daily. And of course, that also affects children because they're often present when cooking is happening. That then, in turn impacts on their ability to be productive, to learn, and of course the productivity of the household at large. Women have to spend hours weekly collecting firewood, and that obviously takes away their time that they could be spending on other things. And I think at large, when we think about those socioeconomic impacts, because the loss of productivity has an economic cost. So does the negative health impact that then is bore by the state or by other actors providing healthcare services, right? Because that then also needs to be covered by somebody's funding. And so these are also those impacts that, if you think about it, if we could reverse them, and eliminate them, those co-benefits, as they tend to be called, I mean, really, they're just benefits. They're not just co-benefits. We talk about co-benefits because we focus on carbon emission reductions and therefore the environmental sort of impact.
Yeah.
But if we look at the socioeconomic impact, if these could be monetized, if there could be a monetary value put on those, that could be huge in case of clean cooking. So there's also now more of that sort of drive to understand, can we do that? Can we do it in a similar vein as what we've done with carbon finance as a result of emission reduction? But kind of linking to that point that you've mentioned about resilience and adaptation, absolutely. I mean, with exacerbating effects of climate change, we're talking about people increasingly having less and less sort of ability to access energy through the sort of natural environment, and that goes for both energy for cooking, for heating, but also electrification. If you talk about not having access to national grid and then limited access to maybe lighting through, I don't know, kerosene or candles or whatever it may be, how can you build a resilient household if you don't have the ability to cook, and you're only ever relying on what's available today but might not be 2 years, 5 years down the line? How can we talk about resilience? And so for that adaptation, sort of resilience building and adaptation, again, something that we very much referred to in the report that we shared earlier, it really is critical that we look at energy access as part of that, as part of a strategy that should be inclusive of those solutions, and again, in a way that is integrated, that looks at energy access holistically, that looks at different populations holistically, whether we're talking about refugees, whether we're talking about local populations, host communities, as we call them, because the same is going to be needed, especially in times when, really, in many of countries hosting refugees, climate change and its impacts are significant and will only get worse as the projections show.
Okay. Yeah, if I were pitching a project to one of the climate funds, you mentioned in terms of the accreditation or finding the right partnership for it, that I acknowledge is a challenge. The advantage of Green Climate Fund, the biggest climate fund, is that there can be many different types of accredited entities. There are many that are working, that are international NGOs or regional NGOs, or even at a country level, we're starting to see actors. Yes, there's certainly a scale and a complexity that is there and built into it. Not necessarily the UN agencies, although you're based within a UN agency, so there's a natural affinity there. And the UN agencies have a very strong mandate for this. But there are many different actors or stakeholders that could be involved in that. I think I would pitch a project that is a resilience project, and the co-benefit is mitigation. I would not even be tracking the emission reductions of the project. The emission reductions of the project are so complex to measure, but we see it as a co-benefit. And we started talking right at the beginning of this discussion saying energy is foundational. It's foundational to everything. It's this cross-cutting thing. Energy for cooking is a part of that overall picture, but it is cross-cutting. Water provision, shelter, these aspects all rely on energy at some way in some level.
Yeah.
I mean, the mitigation aspects are compelling: emissions, deforestation. But as you were saying, that the resilience one, Green Climate Fund at its heart is around focused on vulnerability. Adaptation Fund, it's about vulnerability. And the vulnerability of these communities is increasing because of climate change. So the idea that it's a health issue, it's a safety issue, it's a time-saving issue, it's a conflict reduction issue with refugee, displaced people and host communities. It's a land degradation, deforestation issue. These aspects are compelling of themselves. And it just so happens that the common thread of tool that we're addressing it with is energy. Yeah, we're going to use energy to significantly reduce the vulnerability of these communities, enhance their resilience. And yes, a co-benefit is we get emission reductions, but those emission reductions are largely untrackable and in the big picture are relatively small. Yeah. And untrackable, you can track them at a cost, but it might cost more than the income you get from the emission reductions.
Yeah.
I would pitch an entirely resilience-oriented project at scale. I think GCF, well, there's some debate within the board about whether regional projects really have an impact, but I think the skepticism is about the private sector-led regional projects within the GCF. So I would tend to think that there's an opportunity, a scope there for a regional project, boundaries perhaps covering a certain area that would present a compelling message. And I think GCF, I'm not trying to lecture you, Iwona, on it, but I think GCF should be really open to this. In November last year, they signed a memorandum of understanding, an MOU with UNHCR.
That's right.
I haven't managed to find out what's in the MOU. On the GCF website, they mention it, signing it at the COP. And they said, for more information, click here, and it takes me to their Twitter site, which just has some photos. So it doesn't give me any insight into it, but I'd love to know. So if someone from GCF is listening into this, I'd love to know, or UNHCR, what's behind that. But, I think the door must be at least creaking open a little bit around that and around the opportunity to access this type of funding. The funding is not enough for anyone, so it's competitive.
Of course.
So it is a challenge. It's difficult to navigate. You're perhaps making a request for, $30-40 million. So it's a big project, at least for climate finance side of things, comparatively big project.
Yeah, hopefully, and I really appreciate your perspective, Grant, and it is so refreshing to hear somebody with your expertise and knowledge of the sort of global climate finance space to be advocating for this kind of approach, because it's really not a given. I feel like the fixation has been on carbon emission reductions, and that's why the sort of strong focus on carbon finance, on VCMs, and now with Article 6 sort of kicking in, 6.4, 6.2, on compliance markets. And I think these will remain and have to be looked at as important sort of instruments and frameworks. But I really we actually in sort of light of COP29 last year wrote a blog at the GPA about the opportunities for carbon finance for displacement settings. But this is just one avenue that we will continue exploring. But I 100% agree with you that sort of resilience, mitigation, adaptation, this needs to be really brought to the fore and leveraged for boosting that ability to tap into global climate finance through the GCF, through Jeff, or else, yes, I think sadly we're not going to really fully give credit to the different impacts that we see and outcomes that we can achieve, particularly in terms of boosting resilience and increasing sort of mitigation and adaptation through these kinds of projects, especially if again we promote and really truly sort of take a different approach that is more integrated, that is more holistic, also to break those silos and then demonstrate the full sort of potential for achieving increased resilience and mitigation.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm sharing the blog. This is the blog that you're referring to, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and I've put up there, again, a long way over there in terms of the screen positioning, the QR code for people to be able to access that blog and have a look at it. Right, we didn't get any questions along the way, but I think we've had more than enough to discuss. It's been fantastic to have this discussion with you. I've enjoyed it a lot. You've really explained things really well. I know we've had some people on in the live session that have a lot of knowledge on this, but I suspect we also have quite a number of people for whom the issue is quite new, me included. So it's fantastic to be. I appreciate that you've really walked us through slowly the steps and the challenges and the opportunities that lie here, and hopefully that's inspired some people on it. So what's the best way to contact you? I mean, you're tagged on this event. Is it through LinkedIn?
Yes, LinkedIn, or else I'm happy to also share my email address, perhaps in comments, or otherwise maybe I'll leave it to you, Grant, to share that email address in the most visible space following this event. Thank you so much for having me, for availing this space for this discussion. I really appreciate it. I also hope that this has inspired, informed some of the audience, and otherwise for those who are already engaging in this topic or one of the aspects, because there are multiple, please don't hesitate to reach out. We at the GPA and NORCAP are very open to collaboration, very much want to ensure that there is coordination and joint effort to advance this agenda. So thank you once again for having me and for the discussion, which I've also found very enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you very much, Iwona. If you're interested, we have this Eco Institute. We're building up a waiting list, wanting to train people in advancing their careers in climate finance. So feel free to scan that. Also, I've put the QR code again for the GPA here, and then in the comments, please, if you're watching this afterwards, please do engage in the comments. Iwona and I will monitor those and get back to you with any questions or comments. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Iwona.
Thank you very much, Grant. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
Take care.